starting a new section today, and the section is the Protestant Reformation. Protestant Reformation, very big event in world history and church history, and so we're going to be spending some time on that with what took place during the Protestant Reformation. And we have as a general time frame, 1500 to 1700. That's not hard and fast. I mean, this is just giving you the idea of time frames of when things were taking place, but we bounce back and forth. You know, it might be earlier. There might be some things that are earlier than that, but this is the overall time frame. And there was a lot going on in the 1400s as well, 1300s that were leading up to the Reformation, which is what we're going to see today, some factors that led to the Reformation. But first, some introduction about the Protestant Reformation. The term Protestant refers to the 16th century Reformation in Europe, when multitudes of people rebelled against Rome and new denominations were formed apart from the Catholic Church. The name originated with a group of German princes who protested the Pope in 1529. It has been applied to the denominations that arose from the Reformation era, particularly Lutheran, Presbyterian, Anglican, or also Episcopalian, and Methodist. And so these different denominations that arose from the Reformation, this was not a completely unified movement. So the Protestant Reformation is kind of a catch-all term for what was going on overall in different parts of Europe at that time, where you had things going in one country and then somebody else was doing something in another country. But it really originated with Martin Luther was one of the main figures who really kicked it off. But there were things leading up to that, and then there were some other people that had other hand in what was going on in other countries as well. The Protestant Reformation was a large and complex social, political, and religious phenomenon involving dozens of nations and occurring over a long period. So don't have this in your mind that all of a sudden, boom, the Reformation starts, everybody's kind of all involved together in this Reformation, and then here's what came out of it. It was a lot going on in different places at different times with different people. But the Protestant Reformation is that overall time frame. Just like we would consider the Dark Ages, it's a time frame where there were things going on involving different people, different groups in different countries. And so it's just a helpful term to really get a recognition of, all right, this time frame, these things happen. And so we know what we know what someone's talking about when they say Protestant Reformation. The Protestants came out of Rome, but brought many unscriptural things, and so it's important to remember that they came out of Rome. They protested against Rome and the Pope, but just because they protested against Rome, just because they came out of Rome, does not mean they were completely scriptural in the things that they brought out. They did not completely abandon all of Rome's doctrine, and it really varied depending on which group it was, what people were involved. And so it's important to recognize that, and the viewpoint I like to take on it is to recognize that there were many unscriptural things brought out of it. At the same time, on a bigger picture scale, the Lord used that time in history as a turning point to open doors for what would come later, and certain the settling of America, the religious the aspect of people seeking religious freedom and coming to America, and so the fact that the Bible then was being translated more in Europe then would affect people there, and then those people came to America, and so there was a lot of things that the Lord used the Reformation in order to break, you could say, I don't want to say break the back, but to really hinder the power and the authority and the persecution of the church, of the Catholic Church. And they so the Catholic Church did not have as much control over the Bible. They were trying to stamp out the Bible. That didn't work. They tried to stamp out the Christians. That didn't work. And so the Lord used the Protestant Reformation for a lot of good, even though there were unscriptural things that came through in specific denominations. So they also, it's important to recognize that many of the reformers were persecutors of the Anabaptists. And so kind of along those lines, they brought out many unscriptural things, and along with those unscriptural things, they also took part in some persecution themselves, and it really varied from person to person as far as who it was, what group it was. But the reformers were not necessarily all friends of the Baptists, Anabaptists. And as a matter of fact, Martin Luther is known for writing a book even called The Jews and Their Lies. And that was something that was instrumental in influencing Germany. So you had that aspect of replacement theology, and there's some bad fruit that came out of that as far as the doctrine of replacement theology. But they were persecutors of the Anabaptists. But what led to the Reformation? What conditions existed in Europe that prepared the way for the Reformation? First of all was Rome's corruption. The Inquisition was a dark period in history, and a lot of this we've already covered, so I'm not going into depth with it, but people were worn out by the invasive nature of the Catholic Inquisition. Many people served Rome out of fear, and they desired to throw off the shackles. Only a spark was needed, something that was going to get it moving. But you think about that. I mean, eventually, human nature, people get tired of tyranny and persecution and invasive nature. People eventually, a society wearies of it a little bit, and especially if it's too oppressive. And that's why in some of the most oppressive nations today, what do they need to do? They need to cut off communication with freer nations so that people don't get a taste of what it's like to be free. What do they do in North Korea? They're very cut off. Why? Because, well, you keep people in that bondage, in that darkness, so to speak. And it really is. It's a dark country because of them being cut off and people not having the light of both the light of the gospel allowed in there, although there are those who try in certain ways, I'm sure, but it's very difficult. But there's the light of freedom, the light of liberty. And so what do? They cut it off because they don't want that outside influence infiltrating people, seeing, oh, this is what it's like in other countries. Because just like during the Dark Ages, people just got used to that. I mean, it went on for hundreds and hundreds of years, the Dark Ages. And so they went, so people got used to it. And that's all they know. That's all they know. But eventually, the conditions got to be ripe for something to change, and what was needed was that spark. And even people who were not necessarily Christians, eventually, if there's that spark and they go with it and they're willing to go with it, that makes a big, big difference. And so the Inquisition was part of Rome's corruption. The Babylonian captivity of the popes, we talked about that. The popes were captive in France, and King Philip attempted to have Pope Boniface VIII arrested. The people could, even though it didn't completely work out the way as far as having him arrested, the people could see that the Pope's power was limited. Babylonian captivity of the popes. And so when you see, oh, wait a minute, they're not quite as infallible and powerful as we thought they were. Wow, there's some weakness. There's a little bit of weakness there that we can see. Also, the Papal Schism. That was what we talked about. That's between 1378 and 1417. There were two popes fighting, and then there was a third one fighting over power. Who was the actual pope? Who had rightful claim? And this eroded the authority of the papacy when you had them fighting amongst themselves. Also, the disastrous Crusades from 1095 until 1229. The popes called for wave after wave of crusades to capture Jerusalem from the Muslims. And this was a failure overall, even though there were some limited successes, and the people lost confidence in and fear of the popes. And then also we see the wicked lives of the popes and priests. It was common knowledge that the Catholic leaders were morally corrupt. And one of the points one of the turning points in Luther's rejection of Catholicism was his visit to Rome, where he saw the debauchery. That was he got so upset by that when he took a trip to Rome, and that's what really prompted him to protest and to really take some bold moves against the Catholic Church. And so the wicked lives of the popes and priests contributed to the Reformation period. And then also financial greed. Luther hated the sale of indulgences as the money was used to fund the Pope's extravagant projects and lifestyles. And so indulgences was a problem enough because it's basically making people buy their way into heaven and basically buying God's favor. But it was a money racket for one. So it was theologically wrong, biblically wrong, but it was also a money racket. And so the greed, and eventually that led to Luther and his dislike, his hatred of what they were doing as far as the corruption was concerned. And so there was a lot of corruption in Rome that contributed. And by the way, so this is a combination of things. This is not, there was just one thing that you can point to overall that led to the Reformation, but it was a combination of factors over years and years of things that leading up to that point. And it's when you're living in it, you don't necessarily see it that way. But from a historical standpoint, now that we have the benefit of looking back in history and seeing what was going on, you can say, okay, now we see these factors that led to it, because nothing happens just out of nowhere. Nothing happens out of nowhere. There are things that lead up to a big event or a big time period. And so it's a matter of what's educational for us, can be helpful, is to have an understanding in history what types of things led up to big events in history. And that's what we're looking at right now with what led to the Reformation. When you think about when there were wars that have been fought, one of the most fascinating parts of history was not always the war itself, but what were the things that led to the war? What were the factors between certain nations, certain individuals, certain leaders that then led to that? And then all that was needed was the spark. The next thing that led to that was an influence sort of the Reformation is the printing press. The printing press, fascinating story. I was not familiar with this entire story, but it's pretty fascinating actually. Of course, Johann Gutenberg is the one who's known for the inventing of the movable type printing press. But it was in 1452 that the first book printed in Europe on movable type came off Johann Gutenberg's press in Mainz, Germany. So he was printing some Bibles. He was printing, I believe, there was a Latin Psalter that he printed, and so the fact that you could now he made it possible to print books more quickly allowed for the greater distribution of the Bible and other religious books. And so in 1455, an entire Latin Bible was published. Gutenberg had financial backing from a wealthy man named Johann Fuss, but was later sued by him for non-payment of debts. Now, this is the part I was not familiar with of what happened. Now, maybe some of you are more familiar with this history, but I was reading up about it and found just kind of to me, an intriguing story. But Gutenberg, now what happened was Fuss, he loaned him some money. Now, Fuss was very wealthy, and he loaned him money a couple of times to help with the printing operation. Now, I believe that my understanding is that Gutenberg was one that would take his time because he was very interested in high quality, and so Fuss was not getting his return on investment that he wanted as quickly as he would like. So he sued Gutenberg, and he did win. Gutenberg lost the suit, and Fuss gained control of Gutenberg's printing operation and continued printing with the help of his son-in-law. Maybe Russ can help me with this. He knows German better. Peter Schoffer. How do you say it?
What's that?
Schoffer. How did you pronounce that?
Schaefer.
Schaefer?
Yeah, it's more like
The O has two dots over it. I'm not...
Yeah, that's, I think it's chauffeur.
Chauffeur? Yeah. All right.
But it's, in different parts of Germany, they'll even pronounce names differently.
Okay. Well, and actually, in the book I was using for this series, he said he spelled Faust.
Yeah, Faust, yeah.
But many of the historical websites, like Encyclopedia Britannica and all those, they have it spelled F-U-S-T. So
That's what I was just going to say. In Mainz-Gestel, they have a museum. And Faust is known for, Gutenberg was actually known for starting or inventing the printing press.
yeah.
And Faust took over because Gutenberg just didn't have the backbone and the integrity to keep things going the way it was supposed to be. And that's how it's looked at.
Oh, okay.
Because the Germans are very up on, you have a debt, you pay it timely in the fashion that it's supposed to be.
Yeah.
And it's looked at throughout society like that. So I have
Sure.
no doubt that he won the
Yeah.
lawsuit because
Oh,
that's
yeah.
the general
Yeah.
German mentality. But he is now touted for being the one that's responsible
Right.
for the printing press, and it's Faust that's really
Right.
looked up to in Germany.
Yes. Yeah.
And they got a whole museum on it.
Yeah, yeah, and that's what I was finding is that we look at from our American perspective of history, we look at Johann Gutenberg,
Yeah.
but really it's a lot of the credit has been given to Faust because of how things went with the business operations. So Peter Chauffeur, who had been Gutenberg's most skilled employee, went to work with. He helped Faust, and they sold the printed works for high prices as hand-copied manuscripts. But Faust was found out when the Archbishop and King in Paris compared the copies they had purchased from Faust. And the King and Archbishop had Faust arrested for witchcraft, and Faust admitted to the printing press's existence. And so Gutenberg was trying to keep it a secret. Faust tried to keep it a secret, apparently to make more money. But I guess the writing was on the wall when he was accused of witchcraft, because they're saying, well, how else could these two books be exactly the same except for witchcraft? I mean, because they weren't familiar with the printing press. And so then it became more common knowledge of the printing press's existence. And Mainz was invaded, the printing press was captured, and the printers were scattered. And so when you have these printers, the individuals going throughout Europe, what are they taking with them? They're taking with them the knowledge of the printing press, and then the ball got rolling at that point. When the printers were scattered, so was their knowledge. Within 20 years after the capture of Mainz, dozens of cities across Europe had printing presses of their own. Because of the invention of printing by movable type, the publication of Bibles exploded. And so, once again, that was a major factor. You think about it, you go from a time period in history where very few Bibles available, they have to be hand copied, and then all of a sudden now you have a printing press and you can get them out. I mean, still not near the speed of what printing presses do today, but still. And by the way, some of the major printing press equipment today still comes from Germany. When I was working in the print shop in Florida at college, they had, I think it's Heidelberg presses, and so Germany's still known for their engineering in the printing presses.
When you go to the museum, they have a couple of different variations with just a little bit of time variation, but they will you'll give them a poem or something that you want, and everybody's standing around watching, but they'll set the type and they'll ink it up, and then they'll push it all together with these clamps and put it in this press, and then they'll press out a message. And they'll also let you know that later on they got some that are some kind of it's a rotating. They didn't demonstrate that, but you could put type in this thing and rotate it as you're putting the type in, and then you could ink that up, roll it, ink it up, and then it would roll out, and it would get like 3 copies.
Oh, much more. Yeah. That makes sense. So the advancements even in the printing press over time, but think about the difference, the huge difference when people all of a sudden have access to Bibles when before they didn't. That is another huge factor in leading to the Protestant Reformation. Then we have the Renaissance. The Renaissance, it was not necessarily a Christian movement, but the Renaissance still played a part. It was an explosion of knowledge and learning. It emphasized individual and critical thinking, and it was not afraid to criticize people involved there. That movement, they were not afraid to criticize the Catholic Church. It sought ways to better the condition of man. It emphasized the rights of the individual over the institution. And so all those things, once again, those factors. And once again, remember, God is over all things, and there are times that even if there is a movement itself that's not necessarily rooted in Christianity, rooted in the Bible, God will use various things to accomplish His purposes. And this was another one of those factors that had a major part in the loss of power for the Catholic Church. There's an example of Desiderius Erasmus. He was ordained to the Catholic priesthood and was also influenced by humanist philosophers, but he helped prepare the way for the Reformation by his zeal for knowledge. He studied the Church Fathers, published a Greek New Testament, and opposed many of Rome's practices such as persecution, celibacy, and their laws and ceremonies that they required people to partake in under pain of hell, saying, well, you're going to go to hell if you don't participate in these laws and ceremonies. He likely both empowered Martin Luther's influence. He pretty much enabled Martin Luther, but then also disagreed with him in some ways, but he was very reluctant. At times he was reluctant really to be too critical of Luther. And so not necessarily, that's not an endorsement of Erasmus himself. He certainly had a lot of problems as far as his doctrine and various things, but once again, he was used. He was a part of that during that time that the Lord used to lead to the Reformation, to lead to the downfall as far as of the major power of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church still has a lot of power today and a lot of influence. It's just in a different form than it was back at that time. The fruit of the Renaissance were advancements in art and science. And so there were different advancements. When you think about during the Middle Ages, during those dark ages, it was not a time of advancement. And that's what happens when you have a free society and you have more liberty. That's the time when there have been the greatest advancements. It's not the time of when there's tyranny and oppression. And it's when people are able to put their minds to work and think creatively and with individuality that there's great advancements that come. Unfortunately, the mindset that our country has really going more and more toward is the thinking of the collective rather than the individual, and that's really the focus. And that's a troubling thing because it's the same thing as what's happened in history before. Is well, you got to think collectively. You got to think as one, as a unit. And no, God has created the individual, and so individual and critical thinking is something that is good for a society. It doesn't mean everybody who uses critical thinking is right. It doesn't mean everybody's right all the time. It just means that it's still healthy for a society, for people to be able to think for themselves and not be told to think, not to be lumped into a collective. And I saw an advertisement that was a COVID-19 related advertisement, and I think they even might have used the word collectively, or they've been telling us we're all in this together. They've been telling us this for months and months now. We're all in this together, and so let's all think collectively. Let's all think as one as far as that is concerned. And there's a time for unity of thought in a country. Of course, it's good to have unity of thought in the church, but at the same time, people still need to be. It's not being forced under the pain of persecution or prison or whatever it might be to fall in line with your thinking. You better think the way the Catholic Church wants you to think, or you're going to hell. It's still individual thinking is still a good thing for a society. And then as people have an exchange of ideas, today a lot of people are afraid to have an exchange of ideas because of how polarized our society has gotten. So there's there are people who say, well, we need to think all together and collectively, but then some of those same people, if someone dares to think individually and not think like them, they get ostracized and cast out. There's from a spiritual perspective, from an eternal perspective, I'm not particularly worried about this, but from our society, this tells us something. There was an actress who, I guess she was an MMA fighter about 10 years ago or so, and but then after she lost, she quit. I guess she was getting her head bashed in too much at the end of that one. But she ended up not going back to it. And she got into acting and I guess wanted to be producing. And so she was part of this series, I guess this Disney series. I think it was a Star Wars related series or something on their streaming. And so she said, I guess posted something that was comparing those who are being silenced today with the Jews in leading up to the Holocaust. And the point she was making was that the way that the Holocaust and the Nazi oppression was made possible was because of getting the citizens to think a certain way and look at this group a certain way. And comparing the same with today, that much of the country is trying to be influenced in looking at, well, if you have this conservative position or whatever, might be things that aren't politically correct, that's what then leads to greater oppression in the future when the citizens around are being influenced. So it was just a simple post to highlight that, and so it caused an uproar, in the more easily offended circles, and she ended up getting fired from Lucasfilm, or owned by Disney, because of her viewpoints. But someone can then turn around and say, well, if you have this political viewpoint, well, you're a Nazi, and they can call conservatives Nazis or Republican Nazis, and nothing happens to those people. And so those are the same people who say, well, we need to all think collectively. Well, when they say we need to think collectively, they want you to think the way they think. That's the way it works. And then if you dare to speak out especially when you're in Hollywood, I mean, that's just a cesspool of humanism and wicked thinking. When someone dares to speak out in Hollywood, it's very easy for them to be ostracized as well. And there are very few who do end up speaking out, but this was one. She just made that social media post, and it ended up costing her position in that franchise, in that program. But that's just an example of what happens with that type of thinking. So there are some who, from a more secular point, would say, well, we need to get back to some of the aspects of the Renaissance as far as individual thinking, critical thinking. It's not, individual and critical thinking does not always equate biblical thinking. But the point is, people should be free to think individually and choose to believe the Bible if they want, and not have to, in that time period, go up against the Catholic Church or be afraid of what the Catholic Church would do to them if they decided to believe something different. Economic factors. As the Reformation grew closer, Europe was in a state of flux. A lot of turmoil and upheaval. Constant wars had uprooted multitudes of people and had produced great change in society. The Black Death or bubonic plague had killed tens of millions of people and had produced great changes. Apparently that is where the term quarantine comes from, was from this time period during the bubonic plague. And by the way, if there was ever a time to place people into quarantine, it sounds like that was a good time to place people into quarantine. And what they would do is they'd make the sailors, when they would come in, because that's how it got spread to Europe, was through a ship that came in, and pretty much everybody on board was dead. But before they tried to send the ship back out to sea, but by that time it was too late because it was so contagious and it had already infected someone, and it spread through Europe. But what they would do is they would make these sailors quarantine for 30 days, or they would make them isolate for 30 days. I forget what the term was they used for the 30 days, but then when they went to 40 days, then they got the quarantine. That was the term, quarantine. But when you had, that was literally tens of millions of people, and it was a horrible, horrible sickness to have. The just terrible, terrible thing. And it truly was a plague. I mean, it was a plague. But that had killed tens of millions of people. So you want to think about a change to society. In our current situation, the greatest changes to society came from what the government decided to do, not from the virus itself. You know, it'd be interesting to know what would have happened had the government not taken the measures they did, if what people's behavior would have been like, how much would have changed. Some things would have changed anyway, probably, but not near to the extent as the government shutting things down. But in this case, this was a real plague. This was a very deadly, horrible sickness to have, and it produced great changes in the society. Feudalism was on the decline. Voss says in Exploring Church History, it was paralleled by the rise of towns and nation states. In these towns and states, a new middle class emerged, as did a degree of social mobility not known for more than a millennium. Compared with the old nobility, these striving, successful people were social, political, and economic outsiders. The poor were restless in the midst of these great changes and longed for a way out of their economic and social oppression. That is something that has a big impact on what goes on in a society, is what happens with the poor, those who feel they're left out of an economy, out of society, that they don't have much hope. Eventually that turns into a lot of upheaval and turmoil, and I believe that's part of what we saw this past year. A lot of the root of what we saw, that yes, there have been demonstrations in the past, yes, there have been many, a lot of upheaval, but this past year it was so much more magnified. And of course there were some events that led to that, but what caused just the massive numbers of people? Well, they had nothing. Many of them had nothing else to do at the time. And we had a society shut down, or a lot of businesses shut down, a lot of people just not having enough to do, and so there's a lot of turmoil that resulted from that. And then in some of the most depressed parts of our country, in some of the inner cities, there's a lot of it's the spiritual aspect, really, because when you have people listening to the vile music that they do, or what's called music today. Many of those, they listen to this rap, hip hop stuff that is just the beat itself is a violent type of, not a calming, peaceful. So you have people that are just filled with the wickedness, and then when they don't seem to have hope of going forward, and maybe they don't work hard, maybe they don't look to work hard, or maybe there's not as much economic activity, that causes a lot of upheaval. So much so, and I don't know what set this off, but there was a video I saw that in Illinois, I'm guessing, I don't know what city in Illinois actually, but at a trampoline park of all places, indoor trampoline park, there was just this huge riot fight. I mean, just young people going at it. I mean, this thing went on. Unbelievable. But what happens is, that wasn't the start of a problem. I'm thinking, what would even lead to that? Well, there are factors that then lead to a big event like that, and so that has a big impact on society when there are people who are restless in the midst of great changes. In this case, it ended up turning into a more positive thing for Europe and for the world overall, but sometimes that gets reversed, and you have people that are restless, and then there are those who exploit it for bad. And then also the preaching. John Wickliffe and the Lollards, once again, we covered a lot of this, so I'm not going to spend time, but John Wickliffe and the Lollards, the preaching, the Waldensians, John Huss, the Taborites and United Brethren. These were groups that formed as a result of a general uprising against the Catholic Church. The Taborites were led by John de Traltino, or known as Ziska, and later by Procopius. Girolamo Savonarola. He was a Dominican priest who never left the Catholic Church, but was a study of the Bible and preached against many of Rome's corruptions. He sought to create a free republic in Florence that was similar to Venice, He was excommunicated, arrested, and tried for sedition and heresy in 1497. He was tortured and put to death in 1498. Martin Luther's journey to Rome took him through Florence only 14 years after Savonarola's death. And so once again, there's things, we don't know. I mean, we're looking at it several hundred years out, so we don't necessarily know exactly the level of impact that each of these events had on what went on, but this was what was going on just prior to the, in the hundreds, even a couple hundred years, but especially this one being closer, prior to the Reformation. And then finally, God's sovereign working. God's sovereign working, really that's at the heart of it. We can look at all these other factors, but in the end, it's God taking all these factors, putting it together, and accomplishing what He wanted to have done in just breaking, if you want to say, breaking the log jam, breaking that blockade of opposition to His word, and the persecution that was going on, that would then lead to events, even people coming to America eventually. But Daniel chapter 2, verses 20 and 21 says, Daniel answered and said, Blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are His, and He changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. Notice that He changes the times and the seasons. And so just remember, in the changing seasons of the world, and of a country, that it's God who is ultimately in charge of that. And He removeth kings, He setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. So just remember God's sovereignty and all of what goes on, that we don't need to lose heart. We don't need to worry about, oh boy, these people are in charge now. Boy, I wonder what's going to happen. I mean, this is finished. Now that doesn't mean that it's all good things that happen when God will allow for different reasons certain wicked leaders to come on the scene. Doesn't mean He's always going to. It's not always going to be the righteous, but we just remember God's sovereign working. And so those are things that led up to the Reformation. Then we'll really continue next week with some more specifics about the different groups and denominations involved in that.